Back again. Okay, we've got patent number 2. So this one is pending. It's been a GB patent, UK patent, and just in the last little while it's gone to the international stage, to PCT. And it's where do I start with this? Okay, I'm just going to describe the problem that we set out to solve. The solution that we've got for that problem turns out could solve some other problems as well, and then I'll just touch at the end. We've thrown a few extra things into the patent that would really need to be split out with divisionals later on, but they're just some ideas to build on in future. So the problem we were trying to solve was that as we were building our camera app, and this isn't a video app, it was a stills photo app for the iPhone. We obviously needed a preview screen on the app, and my assumption had always been that the preview screen accurately previews the photos that you're going to take. And it turns out that's not always the case. And it's not always the case on any camera and on every camera. So the particular instance when it falls apart is if you set your camera to have a long shutter speed, so let's say a 1 second exposure, I'll use that as the example, then when you go to look at the preview, make sure you can see this camera. When you go to look at the preview, it's not going to show motion blur. So the photos that you take will have motion blur in them. Let's say the camera is on a tripod. We are looking at a scene with a ping pong match going on, and the ping pong's flying back and forth, and every time we take a photo we've got a ping pong ball that's got motion blur in it. But as we're setting up the shot and looking in the preview screen, the ping pong ball is moving back and forth, but it's dead sharp. There's no motion blur on it. And the reason, so really there are actually 3 desirable attributes for a preview screen around this. One is that it would accurately show you motion blur, or the characteristics of your exposure settings. But the other 2 are that you'd like the preview screen to be live in 2 different ways. Live in that it's got a low latency, so what happens in the scene appears on your screen with no perceptible delay. And secondly, that there's a high frame refresh rate, so as you move your camera around it feels smooth. So we call this patent is labelled smooth preview. Now the camera manufacturers haven't found a way to incorporate all 3 of those. They can do 1 or 2 of them, but not 3. And the 2 that they generally choose to do is give you a preview screen that's live, so a preview screen that has low latency and high frame rate. But they don't deliver on an accurate preview. I think there's 1 or 2 camera companies that have tried it the other way around, and they do give you an accurate preview, but then you have a frame refresh rate that's, in our example, 1 frame per second. So the camera is taking a photograph, a 1 second photograph, it captures the motion blur, it presents that image to the screen, you get to accurately see what was happening in the scene, but it's a low frame refresh rate and the latency is up to a second. Now for us, we were making this EXPODO camera app. It's all about controlling exposure, it's all about being intuitive and people seeing, being WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get, and we weren't satisfied with not having all 3 of these attributes, and so we've figured a way to do it, and that's what I'm going to walk us through now. And before I go through the how, I'm going to show you it working in our app. So let me advance the slide and see if this goes.
Okay guys, so 3, 2, 1.
Now before I let this play, let me just explain what you're looking at. This is a screen recording of our EXPODO camera app. It takes still photos, not video, but what you see on the screen is the video preview. So as with all cameras, it has a video preview so that you can set yourself up to take your still photo. And what's going to be unusual in this little video that you're going to see is that anything that's moving, and there's going to be people moving in it, those people are going to display motion blur. And the things that are not moving, like the table and the background and there's a woman sat there, they will all be sharp because they're not moving. So let's watch this. If you look closely, you can see this is the Chinese version of the app, but it is set to a 1 second exposure. So any photos you take will look the same as this. I'll just get it playing again.
Come on, come and sit down. Come and all move together.
Surprise! Surprise!
Okay.
Yeah, there we go. So the world's first camera preview where what you see is what you get. So we've achieved these 3 objectives: accurately previewing motion blur with low latency and a high frame rate. And the way we did it is that our camera takes it's continuously shooting video. So what's showed on screen here are 30 frames. This is an illustration of capturing 30 frames. It won't stop there, it'll just keep on taking more frames, but let's just look at these 30 frames. We then take those 30 frames and combine them. And we combine them using a stacking method. It might be an additive additive stacking method, or an averaging stacking method. But basically, that if you think back to that video example we just saw, that iPhone was sitting on a tripod, and so and it was actually the same as this example. So over 30 frames, one person might have moved from one side of the screen to the other, and so they'll be averaged and we'll see them blurred. So we're creating synthetic long exposures we're creating synthetic 1 second exposures by combining 30 30th of a second exposures, and that synthetic long exposure then becomes a video frame in the preview screen on our camera. And that whole operation of combining 30 frames, the most recent 30 frames, and dropping it into the conveyor belt for our video preview, that whole operation happens 30 times a second. So it means that what we're seeing on the preview screen is video frames that are only presented for a 30th of a second, but they contain information from a whole second, and it's a rolling process. So the set of images to be combined, we're always adjusting that set. So we drop one off the back and add a new one on the front, combine it again, and take our combined image and drop it into onto the preview screen, and we just keep repeating that. Hopefully that's obvious. So yeah, we just keep doing that. Now, I'm quite confident that no one's done that before, and the reason we find it useful is that it just makes, well, it's useful for beginners and it's useful for professionals. For beginners, when you're learning about exposure and learning about aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, it's nice if you can change these controls, like change shutter speed, and see the effect in real time, as opposed to changing it, seeing nothing, having to take a photo, go into your camera roll, seeing what the effect is, come back into camera mode, take another photo. It's like your whole feedback loop has been broken and extra steps put in there. So learning is retarded if in the current system, and it'll be much faster with this. And it's better for professionals because they can see the shot they're going to get. You know, if you're a sports photographer and you're wanting to get motion blur in a ping pong ball, well, you'll see how much you're going to get. And if you're wanting to freeze a racing car as it whizzes around the track, you'll see exactly what you're going to get. Now, the same thing can be used for video, and we've got these two other applications for this basic method that address two other use cases, and I'm not going to put as much emphasis on them as for the first. I think this first one is very solid. The second might not be as useful, might not be as significant a use case, and the third one, maybe the patent examiner is going to come back and say it's obvious, and I'll explain why. But let's go through them anyway. Fingers crossed, we've got some extra reasons to be cheerful. So the second one is flexible frame rate. So you'll remember that when The Hobbit came out, there was a bit of a hoo-ha because it had been filmed at 48 frames per second, and lots of people didn't like how that looked. Well, with the method that we've just done, let's say Peter Jackson wanted to film it at 48. There are some reasons why you might want to film at higher frame rates, and you might even want to go higher than 48. Let's say you want to go to 120 frames per second, or with a really powerful camera, 1,000 frames a second. Maybe every time you've got a fight scene in a video, in your film, you want to shoot it at a high frame rate, so that you have the option to play it in slow motion. And yet, generally, you want your film to be playing at 24 frames a second, because there's this tiny amount of motion blur that exists in each of those frames, those 24 FPS frames, and that feels right for the viewer. It's filmic, it's cinematic, and maybe the DP wants to see that on set, but the post-production folk want to have the flexibility of 1,000 FPS. So you can have the best of both worlds if you're filming in 1,000 frames per second, but the DP is viewing it at a synthetic 24 frames per second using the method that we've just looked at. You basically get to decouple the frames per second capture rate from the frames per second presentation rate, and you're able to reintroduce the blur that would have existed if you'd done it at slower frame rates. Hopefully that makes sense. Like I said, I don't know quite how big that market is, that need, that pain, but there we are. And then on to the third, which I think is a big deal in terms of what it can do. So I'm calling this the virtual tripod, and you can use it for live streaming, handheld video in low light, really any application for video that needs to be seen in real time or near real time. So if you were a firefighter or a fire and rescue person with an augmented reality headset with helmet mounted camera, and you were walking around in let's say some situation where there's very low light, and you want to have a high quality image, and it's got to be low latency and high frame rate. It's got to be smooth and live. That's difficult to do. It's difficult to do when there's very, very little light, and normally you just boost up the ISO, but that's not really doing anything other than just turning up the volume. It doesn't add more information. What we want is more light, more information, and using the method we've just seen, we can get more light, we can get more information, because we can access more photons by reaching back in time and getting the photons from the earlier video frames. The problem is, if your camera is handheld and you're moving around, or if it's a helmet and you're moving around, then the viewpoint of the camera keeps changing, and you can't line up your images very well. You can't do what Apple does in night mode on the iPhone. If you're taking a still image and you hold the camera still, steady enough for say 3 seconds, it captures a stream of video. It throws away any shots that have got moving subjects in it. It aligns the shots that are left and makes a higher quality still image. That doesn't really work if your camera's moving. And I'm now going to start walking through a sequence of problem solution. And really this whole sequence is prior art, and it's only at the last step that we're going to move into the novel step, the innovative step of this invention. And patent examiner might say that last step is obvious, and we'll have to challenge that. Anyway, the technical effect is a good one because it means that we can shoot high quality video and present it live, even when handheld in low light. So let's just go through that sequence of steps. We've got so the Apple iPhone solution doesn't work because we're panning. We're panning our camera, or it's moving around like this. So what do? Well, the technique you'd use is homeographic transformation. You each of your, let's say, last 30 photographs were each taken in a different position with a slightly different orientation of the camera, and you need to know the 3D coordinates of the camera and its orientation for each of those shots. If you know that, then you can distort all the images so that they look as if they were taken from a single viewpoint, from a single or possibly virtual viewpoint. And then having homeographically transformed them, they should be aligned, but you can do some final alignment, and then you can stack them. And in stacking them, you'll essentially be doing a denoising operation, and you'll get a high quality image. You're benefiting from the photons that landed on all those frames. Now, the quality of the image is going to be dependent on the alignment, which is dependent on the homeographic transformation, which is dependent on the quality of your 3D coordinates. And the 3D coordinates can be hard to come by. If your camera was on a jig, running on a track, you might have already worked out with high accuracy. You might have already calibrated. You might know exactly where it is for each shot. But if it's handheld or it's head mounted, then you're not going to know that. And so the solution to that problem, I said it's a sequence of problem solution. The solution to that is to, as well as having a camera, have a depth sensing device. So that might be LiDAR, might be stereographic, might be holographic LiDAR. Could be all sorts of different things. It's probably got an infrared light source in it. And with that depth sensor, you create a depth map. And with that depth map, you find reference points, and you can, from those reference points, you find reference points that are common across frames, and with those reference points you triangulate or trilaterate back to the position of the camera and its orientation. So you now know the 3D coordinates of the camera for each of the frames. The problem is that now we're sort of getting close to the end of the prior art and the new thing. The problem with all that is that because we as humans have eyes in the front of our heads, we look forwards, and we like taking photos and videos in the same way. We point our cameras forwards, and we tend to put our depth sensing devices oriented in the same way. They look at the same scene, they look forwards, and so that then means that the things that we're looking at are forwards, and they're not always great reference points. So good reference points would be things like hard surfaces, corners and sharp edges, and you want them at wide angles so that your trigonometry works well, not shallow angles where it doesn't. and you want them to be close to the camera, because especially if you're relying in low light conditions on your infrared lamp, then that lamp is going to drop off with the inverse square law over distance, so you want things close by so that they are close enough to reflect infrared light back to your sensor, your depth sensing sensor. But particularly if you're outdoors, you're going to find a situation like this. So we get back to the slides. So here's our operator holding a device which has inside it a camera pointing forwards that sees a field of view, and the top half of that field of view is probably going to be sky, and you might see a cloud in it, but that's diffuse. There might also be subjects that are moving. I've put a bicycle here, but imagine if you were moving through a crowd of people in low light, or it was a wedding situation maybe. Lots of people moving, then all of your reference points, if they're people, if all of the objects that you can see are moving, then that's not going to help over the course of a second. And also because you're looking forwards, a good chunk of your field of view is quite far off into the distance. If it isn't in the sky, it's in the distance, and it's really only a small portion that's on the ground and near to you. It's like a bit of a slither at the front lower edge, and maybe not even that. So what if, and here comes the novel step, which examiners might say is obvious, but why don't you have a depth sensing device that you point downwards towards the ground? Because if you do that, then all kinds of hard surfaces, sharp edges and clean corners pop in view, and you're able to, even if you were walking amongst a crowd of people, you'd be able to see the ground and see rocks and stones and corners and edges, and from that, those very close points, be able to triangulate and trilaterate the position of your camera for all of those shots, and then you can you've got accurate 3D coordinates, you can do accurate homographic transformations, you can accurately align your images, you can accurately stack them, and you can get higher quality combined images which then form your video frames, so you can get live streamed high quality video frames even in low light handheld conditions. So I think that's a good one. It's got this obviousness challenge, but there we are. So to go back, the WYSIWYG thing was the reason for doing this in the first place, and the three that we've got are the WYSIWYG preview, the flexible frame rate, and the virtual tripod. There's a few other ideas that we've packed into the end of the patent, but they're really ideas for future inventions, and any mention that we've got here is really just to get some early, some priority date on them. I think the main one, and it's all rather speculative, but I've got some ideas around sensor design for increasing ISO, high ISO, high base ISO. It's a design that would be wide spectrum, so covering visible light but also infrared, so you could use it as a sensor that was a video or a still image sensor but was also a depth sensor at the same time. And it's also got increased well depth, so you can each photo site can essentially store more light before it needs to be read. Anyway, there we go. Great to chat about it all. Those are our two patents.